Shalom, and welcome to this presentation on participant analysis in Psalms layer by layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. My name is Oobie Weinberg, and I have the privilege of working on the exegetical team in Psalms layer by layer. This presentation will be split into three main sections. To begin, we'll do an introduction of participant analysis, looking at its two main tasks and some of the challenges involved, including some examples. Then, we'll look at the participant analysis of Psalm 118, beginning with an overview of all of the resources that we produce in Psalms layer by layer, followed by a walkthrough of the participant analysis of this fascinating psalm. And at the very end, a few suggestions will be offered to take away. Beginning then with an introduction to participant analysis. Participant analysis can be split into two main overlapping tasks. The first task is identification, the identification of participants. The task of identification simply involves the question, who are the participants, who are the characters involved in this psalm? The second task is tracking, the tracking of participants. So once we know who the participants are, we then need to ask the question of which participant is being referred to in each mention. Now, a mention is any textual item that references a participant. So this might be explicitly the name of a participant, or a title, or an epithet, or a noun phrase. It can be a pronoun, he, she, they, suffixes, verbs, and more. Anything that references somebody. Now, sometimes these are explicit and clear, and sometimes they can be very ambiguous and difficult to track. These ambiguities bring us to the challenges of participant analysis. Once we've recognized these two overlapping tasks of identification and tracking, it helps us recognize four variations in participant analysis challenges. Now first, you have the ideal situation where you have both clear identification and clear tracking. Take, for example, Psalm 3, where we've got both clear identification of who are the participants in the psalm and quite clear tracking of who is being referred to at any given point. You've got the main participants of David, the Lord, David's enemies, and David's son Avshalom, Absalom. So you can see here just in the first two verses, we've got the historical superscription, a psalm of David, Mizmor David, bevorcho mipnei Avshalom beno, when he fled from Avshalom, his son. Okay, so this gives us immediately an introduction to who the participants are, what the historical setting was, and then we continue through the psalm and we see that David explicitly addresses Adonai, the Lord, in the vocative. And so we know who he's speaking to, who he's speaking about. He's referencing his enemies. And the first person speaking here, my foes against me, is clearly David. So it's clear identification throughout, who are the participants involved, and clear tracking, who's being referred to either as speaker and addressee or as the actual discourse participants, who's being referred to at any given point. Now, unfortunately, most of the time, it's not so straightforward. So the second variation you get is when you have clear identification but unclear tracking. So it might be clear who the participants are, but it becomes quite ambiguous, vague, or unspecified who's speaking at any given point, or whom they're speaking to, or who's being referred to. Sometimes it's very unclear if it's a king speaking, or God speaking, or a priest speaking, and it's not always straightforward to track who's being referred to at any given point. Third, you can have unclear identification but clear tracking. So this might be a psalm where you have a group speaking in the first person, plural, we praise you, O God. And then you've got somebody speaking in the first person singular, an I, who says, I praise you, O God, and grant me salvation from my enemies as I cry out to you. But at no point does the psalm tell us who the we is and who the I is. And so we have to guess. Now it's clear to track at which point who's speaking or who's being referred to or who's being addressed. But it's not clear, and it becomes a bit of a guessing game or a research project to figure out who are the psalms, the task of identification. Now the fourth variation, as you might guess, is when, unfortunately, we've got unclear identification and unclear tracking. Now let's look at an example of this to illustrate some of the challenges that you can face in participant analysis. Psalm 75 is notoriously difficult for participant analysis. So you can see here an illustration of one scholar's reading. This is taken from a research paper by Ervich and from 2021. So according to this scholar, you can see, just looking for now at who's speaking at any given point without even tracking the rest of the participants. This scholar proposes that we have Israel, the Lord, and a priest. And at some point, we've got the community of Israel speaking in the first person in verse 2, And then 3 and 4, the Lord begins to speak. And then verses 5 to 10, you have a priest speaking. And then finally, the Lord speaks again. Now let's contrast this with another scholar's reading of Psalm 75. Look at the difference between these two readings. Suddenly, instead of having a priest, we now have Israel, a prophet speaking on behalf of the Lord, or the Lord speaking through a prophet, then the Lord himself, and then a king. And so you can see quite strikingly the differences between just tracking the speakers without even beginning to track the rest of the participants. So this shows us just how challenging participant analysis can be, but it also illustrates how important participant analysis is. If you contrast these two scholars' readings of Psalm 75, you can see how strikingly different they are, and there's many others, by the way. So it gets you right down to the level of the coherence of the psalm as a whole. Participant analysis forces you, by tracking the speaker, the addressee, and the participants being referred to in every single mention in the text. It really forces you to get into the coherence of the psalm as a complete literary unit. Now, in the Psalms Layer by Layer project, we try to stay as engaged as possible with the most up-to-date linguistic and exegetical research. And in recent years, there's been some excellent resources and techniques developed both in linguistics and exegesis for participant analysis. And at this very moment in the project, we are working on and formulating some of the mechanics and the techniques that we use for participant analysis. However, in this presentation, I thought it would be more helpful to jump to the end product and look at an overview of an example of what we end up with and what's available for users in participant analysis, using the example of Psalm 118. And for those who are interested in some of the more technical or mechanical side of participant analysis and how we do this, some suggestions and resources will be made available at the end of this presentation. So what is included in a participant analysis of Psalms in the Psalms Layer by Layer project? Well, if you go to our website, of course, once we've completed developing all of our resources, for any given psalm, you'll find 7 elements in our presentation of the participant analysis of any given psalm. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of these, and a link will be made available for those who want to explore further, look at these in more detail, for at least Psalm 118 and other psalms, of course, are in development. So the first item that we produce is a participant list. This will look like this. Now this includes a simple table, and in that table you have the main participant, and then underneath that participant you have all the appellations, all the different ways that that participant is referred to in the psalm. So here, if you look down at enemies, the second row from the bottom, sometimes they're called those who hate me, sometimes they're called all nations, sometimes imagery of bees is used, but each time it's referring to the main participant of enemies. Then on this table, you also have participants organized according to participant sets. So synonymous and related participants are listed with either the same color or a different shade of the same color to organize them in groups. So this is the participant list that you get for every single psalm by the end of your analysis. Now this participant list appears adjacent to the participant text table, which you've already seen a few examples of. So here you can see the whole participant text table for Psalm 118. And on the left, you have the speaker column, and on the right, you have the addressee column. And then in the middle, you have the Hebrew and English text. So as you work through the psalm, you track as best as you can, sometimes it's very ambiguous or unspecified, who the speaker is. And on the right, you track who's being spoken to or who's being addressed. In the text columns, we track what's called the subject and predicate participants, the actual participants being referred to in the discourse itself. So who is the subject of this verb? Who's the object expressed by the suffix in this verb? Or any mention of a participant is highlighted according to the participant color in the text table. And so by the end, you can walk through the whole psalm and read it as if you're reading a play. You see who's speaking at any given point. And then you have highlighted all the participants being referred to throughout the text. Now, alongside the participant list and the text table, we have tracking notes. Now, sometimes these will be extensive and very detailed, as you can see here for Psalm 118, which is quite complex for participant analysis. And sometimes you'll have maybe no notes or just one note at a point where there's maybe a little bit of ambiguity. So you can see here a note will look like this. You can see alternatives of who might be the participant at any given point, and then the arguments and some resources or secondary literature engaging with that discussion. Now, sometimes it will be a very difficult issue, and we'll create an exegetical issue page. And you can look at our website to see all of our exegetical issue pages for participant issues that are really difficult. Now, the fourth item on our list is what we call the tracking table. So you can see the overview of it here. Even this isn't quite the whole of Psalm 118, but let's look at it in a little bit more detail here with just the first 6 verses. So a lot of the analysis here overlaps with what we've done on the text table. You've got the speaker and addressee listed here. But then in the text table, we just analyze the participant being referred to in the text. But here we go into a little bit more detail and we track the subject and predicative participant. So who's the subject of the verb or the clause, and then who is any other participant referred to either as a direct object or governing a prepositional phrase. And as we track this, we have this participant relationships column where we begin to extract and abstract, you might say, the main participant relationships that are unfolding. So you can see here in verse 5 when it's Mina metzal karati ya anani b'merhav ya. So I cried out to the Lord from the tight place, and he answered me with spaciousness. So we begin to abstract that the leader is the one crying out to the Lord, and the Lord is answering the leader. And this will become significant at the end when we create a visual to summarize the main relationships of the psalm. Now, the other thing that we do in this tracking table is structural analysis. So coming back to the big picture here, you can see that we track main divisions in the text, or major, medium, and minor divisions. So this might be a complete scene shift where all the participants change, or it might be a minor shift when we've got maybe a new subject introduced, or a shift in grammatical person. And so we do a lot of our structural analysis here on this table. Then after the tracking table, another thing we create at the end is what we call profile notes. Now, this is simply an introduction, if necessary, to key participants in the psalm. So this is the first thing you're going to see when you open the page on our website for participant analysis for any given psalm. You'll see the list of participants that we saw in item 1. And next to that, if necessary, some explanation might be needed to clarify who is who, or why they're given that label, perhaps. Then we come to number 6 when we produce a summary visual. And this is where we try to synthesize as concisely as possible the main relationships that are included. And so again, you can go and look at this in more detail afterwards. And then finally, we take that summary visual and we put it in prose format, in a very brief sentence format. Now, as I said, all of these resources for all of the Psalms will be available eventually for free at our website, psalms.cdbr.org. But of course, all of this is in development, so some of them will be complete with all of these 7 features. Some of them might have an older formatting that we haven't updated yet, as we're still refining some of our methods. But this is where we're at, and we're very excited to continue the project and create all of these resources for every single psalm in the Psalter, God willing. For the remainder of this presentation, I would like to walk through the participant analysis of Psalm 118, primarily walking through the text table that has been created. But first, it's helpful to look at just a brief overview. This is from our synthesis page, also available on our website, looking at just an overview of the main sections of Psalm 118. So the psalm essentially involves a leader, probably a king, but he's not explicitly called a king, so we call him a leader of Israel who has experienced some kind of delivery or salvation from the Lord in the context of distress, probably a military conflict of some kind. And after he's won this victory and God has saved and delivered him and granted him success, he gathers in Jerusalem with all the people, the priests and the laity and everybody else outside the temple gates, moving towards the temple to perform a thanksgiving ceremony, a thanksgiving sacrifice, ultimately to give thanks to the Lord, both individually as the leader and communally with all the people. So it opens verses 1 to 4 with this thanksgiving chorus, which we'll look at in a second, where all the people antiphonally, back and forth, sing their thanksgiving to the Lord. Then verse 5 to 18 is the leader's testimony. So here the leader is describing the distress that he experienced, and also seeing how the Lord delivered him and granted him success. He describes his present confidence and future confidence in the Lord's help. Then verse 19 and 20 are a a bridge section where the leader passes through the gates into the temple complex, and the gatekeepers, who are priests waiting there for him, welcome him coming in. And that marks at the same time the beginning of this final celebration where all the people gather together. And in that final celebration is a really rich section for participant analysis, because all the different voices come in at different points, addressing the Lord, addressing each other, blessing each other, and there's this final celebration. And then verse 29, the psalm closes where it began, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki le'olam hasdo. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, and his chesed is forever. So we're going to begin now in verses 1 to 4 with the Thanksgiving chorus. So this opens, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki le'olam hasdo. Yomarna Israel ki le'olam hasdo. Yomaruna veit Aharon ki le'olam hasdo. Yomaruna yir'ei Adonai ki le'olam hasdo. So the idea here is this antiphonal liturgical setting where you probably have a priestly chorus leader who opens with this Thanksgiving chorus, this famous Thanksgiving chorus. And then he calls on different parties present to respond in their completion or their echo of the Thanksgiving chorus. So in verse 2a, the chorus leader calls out to the crowd, not the priests, and says, Yomarna Israel, let Israel say. And then the crowd probably at this point raises their voice and they say, Ki le'olam hasdo. And then the chorus leader turns to the priest and says, Yomruna veit Aharon, let the house of Aaron say, Ki le'olam hasdo, call the priests back. And then the third party is Yomruna yir'ei Adonai, let those who fear the Lord say. Now this was one of the exegetical issues for Psalm 118, because some people say that those who fear the Lord here refers specifically to Gentile proselytes. And others would say that this is a way of calling all people together into their true identity as those who fear the Lord, which may have even included Gentile proselytes who were there. But it's not referring specifically to them, but it refers to the priests and the laity all together, everybody present, coming as one voice together, Ki le'olam hasdo. So obviously the second reading is what we've chosen, but you can look at the public exegetical issue page to see the arguments for both. So this is the opening Thanksgiving chorus. And then after that, we come to the testimony. So the leader now enters onto the stage and begins to describe his distress and the Lord's salvation. Now, unfortunately, we won't have time to read through every verse here and go through this in detail, but you can see that the leader begins his testimony, addressing all present and telling them, Min hamitzar karati Yah, anani v'merhav Yah. From the tight place I cried out to Yah, and Yah answered me with spaciousness. And then he goes on to describe his confidence in the Lord. What can man do to me? I will look in triumph on those who hate me. And then in verse 10, he begins to describe his enemies. So here you see the enemies really come onto stage. Kol goyim sevavuni b'shem Adonai ki amilam. Sabuni gam sevavuni b'shem Adonai ki amilam. Sabuni chidvorim do'achu k'esh kotzim b'shem Adonai ki amilam. So he's describing how all the nations surrounded him. They surrounded him. But his victory is in the name of the Lord. Then he continues his testimony, switching in verse 13. This was a really difficult part of the participant analysis, where he says, Daho dahitani linpol, v'Adonai azarani. You pushed me down hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. And here the leader suddenly goes from speaking in the third person about those enemies back then to addressing in the second person a specific enemy who pushed him down. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of this, but you can look at all the notes on the exegetical issue page that I think he may be addressing death itself personified. And you can see the arguments for that in the notes. But if not that, then there's some kind of ambiguous, abstract enemy that he addresses as one enemy. Then he continues with his celebration and declaration of his confidence in the Lord until we arrive to verse 19. The leader seems to arrive now at the gate entrance in verse 19. And now he switches the addressee and specifically addresses the priests waiting there. Pitholi sha'arei tzedek, havo v'amodeya. Open for me the gates of righteousness. I will enter through them. I will give thanks to the Lord. Now, most commentators, and I've come to agree with them, say that at this point then in verse 20 is the priest's response. So they respond to the leader's instruction to open the gates by saying and declaring, Zeh hasha'ar ladonai, tzadikim yavovo. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous enter through it. And with that, the leader most likely passes through the gate into the temple complex, accompanied by the crowd and the priests, which begins the celebration. Now, this celebration section is one of the hardest participant analysis sections that we've come across in the project so far. And the reason is because it's full of person, gender, number shifts in the text that are not explicitly explained. It's like reading a script of a play, but the left column, which tells you the speaker at any given point, is deleted. And so you have to try and track all these hints and figure out who's speaking to whom at which point. Now, I don't have time to go into all the arguments. You can read on those on our website and read through the notes there. But let me walk you through what I think is the most coherent explanation. So verse 21 is, I think, the most climactic moment of the psalm. The leader has passed through into the temple complex and now for the first time addresses the Lord directly in the second person. Odecha ki anitani. I thank you, for you have answered me and become my salvation. Then the crowd pipes in and they describe how they see the Lord's salvation of the leader in their own words. So here they are celebrating the stone that was that the builders rejected has become the top of the corner. There's an exegetical issue you can read about there. Cornerstone, capstone, that's a fun one. But then they celebrate how this has all been from the Lord. So you have the crowd's testimony, if you like. Then in verse 25, the crowd shifts addressee and says, Anna Adonai Hoshi'ana, Anna Adonai Hatzlihana. So they add their prayer directly to the Lord. Now in response to that prayer, the priests then speak up and say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai berachnuchem mi beit Adonai. So here we discern that who's the one who would be pronouncing a blessing? Well, it would be the priests. So first they bless the leader, and then they bless the crowd. Berachnuchem. We've got that plural suffix that points us there to the crowd. Then I think the crowd respond at this point, similar to something you have in Psalm 67, responding to the priestly blessing. El Adonai vaya'er lanu. The Lord is God, and He has made His light to shine on us. He has showed us favor. Then at this point, we come to this instruction to bind the festival sacrifice with cords. There's an exegetical issue on that verse as well, if you're interested. And this was really hard to work out who exactly the speaker was, but I think the best guess is it's probably the leader speaking again at this point. And so he instructs the sacrifice to be prepared, and then clearly in verse 28, the leader begins very paralleled to verse 21. Eli ata ve'odeka, you are my God, and I will give thanks to you. Then finally in verse 29, everybody, all the voices together join as one. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki le'olam hasdo. And that's the final chorus here, matching the opening chorus we had at the beginning. So there you have an overview of the participant analysis of Psalm 118 in the Psalms Layer by Layer project. And I want to close just with some suggestions that you can take away and consider for yourself. So the first is just to remember that all these resources are available for free and still in development at our website, psalms.cdbr.org. So if anything came up in the presentation you wanted to look at in more detail, you can have a look there. Second is to suggest that you do your own participant analysis. Now, if you're working on the Psalms or you're interested really in any text, it's a really, really rich method of analysis. Now, the starting point for this that anybody can do is simply to track speaker, addressee, and then highlight same way that I've done in the text table, the Hebrew text and the English text, and create a list of participants. And then finally, as I mentioned, for those who would like to engage with some of the more technical issues or some of our methodology around participant analysis and linguistic method, you can see this link on our website. It's the participant analysis section, which is also in development. There's some appendices there that will be dealing with some of the important secondary literature on the subject. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you for listening.